Okay, we'll get going. So, hearty welcome to all of you who have joined us this morning. This is one in a series of many webinars that CHP Australia has held over the past, past couple of years, but in particular during COVID, over the past 6 months. We've done obviously all our seminars virtually and have had quite great response. So thank you for joining this one as well. A couple of housekeeping things. We will finish at 10, as I said. We will have a Q&A opportunity with our speaker. So if you want to send through your questions via the Q&A function, I'll get to as many of those at the end as I can. And if we can't deal with them all, I'm sure our speaker will handle them offline. The other thing is we will be making the slides available to you after the presentation. So to get started, I want to give a wonderful welcome to Susan Redden Makatoa from Edelman. Susan has amazing credentials. I won't go through them all, but when I asked her about her background, and we got a lot of detail, I'll give you some highlights. She's basically been in the comms and PR profession for many years, well over 20 years, across many gold star, I guess, organizations, if you want to, if I could say that. Currently at Edelman, obviously, she's the group managing director. She's had previous senior roles, including group managing director at Ogilvy PR in Australia, which is one of the largest firms here. She is a fellow at the Public Relations Institute of Australia, has won several awards there, Gold Quill Awards, some regional awards, and some national Golden Target Awards. She's also a speaker at various venues, including TEDx and other institutions. And quite pleased, she's quite passionate about the diversity and inclusion area and has done some work in that area, as well as sitting on boards. So that's a quick skip through Susan. Without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Susan. Thank you so much for preparing for today and being with us today. And I will come back at the end to handle some questions. So over to you, Susan.
Thank you so much. And I'm also the executive sponsor of the healthcare practice at Edelman. So I had a quick look at the respondee list, and there's quite a few people on this call I know. So hello to you, and for the rest of you, lovely to meet you virtually. But let's jump in, shall we? I've prepared what I'd call a Frankenstein deck, because we've done so many Edelman Trust Barometers in the last little while that there's been so much movement. I've kind of taken a cherry pick approach and prepared some things for you. So just a word on the Edelman Trust Barometer. It was an exploration of trust that began 20 years ago after the Battle of Seattle WTO protests, and we noticed the rising influence of NGOs, and we've continued to track the rise and fall of business, government, NGOs and the media over the years. So what I want to cover today is a quick welcome and a background to trust, the trust in healthcare in Australia and the implications for that, so what we can do with that, and obviously take your questions. And I love a good chat if you know me, so I'm very happy to take questions and do my best to answer them. So I think we've already established who I am, so that's a oddly flattering picture. You can see actually what I look like, so let's move on from that. So just a word about Edelman. We're the world's largest independent global communications consultancy, and we do all of those things. We're family owned and independent and increasingly purpose driven, which makes it an absolute pleasure to work with. And we've got a global network of healthcare communicators who are incredibly generous with their time. Whenever you pop your head up and say, hey, does anyone know about this therapy area? You know, you just get all this information pouring in. So that's a pleasure to work with them. So just a word in trust, you know, we've seen a whole lot of trends emerge over the last little while. So there's been a decline in the credibility of figures of authority, a rise in peer-to-peer influence and increased trust in people like myself. So people tend to believe people who they relate to, growing unease around the quality of news and the information that's served up to us by algorithms, which reinforce our biases. And we're seeing we're seeing a battle for the truth waged on platforms that's increasingly effective at influence how we view the world. So I don't think I probably need to explain too much to this audience why trust matters, but trust is increasingly important in this, really uncertain world. So consumers are more likely to buy from an organisation that they trust and be an advocate for it. Trust absolutely drives workplace retention and productivity. Regulators, if you are a trusted organisation, you probably have a much better chance at influencing them and engaging with them positively. Investors, especially in Australia, there's a real push for purpose-driven investment, so demonstrating that is really important. Resilience against risk, and what could be more indicative of that than this ridiculous year that we're in, obviously in the market, and then in media coverage. So if media trust you, they're more likely to listen to what you have to say positively or defensively. So just a word on how we do it. So we do 34,000 respondents for the broad Edelman Trust Barometer, which comes out each year. And the first bit I'm going to show you was actually done at the end of last year, but I have updates to that. Probably what's important to know is that we look at an oversample of what we call the informed public, and so that is they need to be in that working age. They're university educated. They're in the top household income, top quartile of income, and they're probably much more likely to be engaging in media, in policy, and in business news. And then we also do the mass population, not so relevant for this, but we also did an oversample this year of Gen Z. So the trust in Australian healthcare, there's no doubt that Australia is at an important crossroad, and we're seeking leadership on important defining economic and cultural social reforms, and we do so in the middle of what at the start of the year was a crisis of trust. As we start the new decade in a post-trust era, is this our new reality? And I just want to demonstrate to you how much things have shifted this year. Okay, so if we look at the start of this year, Australia was one of the least trusting countries in the world, and we measure across four institutions: government, NGOs, companies, business, and the media. And Australia was sitting in a place of distrust. And what was remarkable is that was the 10th year straight that Australia was sitting there with their arms folded going, no, I don't trust any of you guys. So what was interesting also at the start of this year, that some of the more developing or highly controlled countries actually had a much higher rate of trust. The biggest shock finding earlier this year was this one, is that Australia actually had the biggest trust gap. So you can see, I don't know how big this is for you, but you see Australia sitting at 45, but I was talking about the informed public and the general population. There was a 23-point trust gap, and I'll show you what that looks like. It was the biggest in the history of the Trust Barometer anywhere in the world. So at the start of this year, or the end of last year, start of this year, the informed public was sitting fairly comfortably. They're like, yeah, NGOs are doing okay. Business, I trust them. Government and even media was sitting in probably much neutral territory, but fairly trusted. But the mass population didn't trust any institutions at all. And overall, that meant in Australia that nobody trusted anyone very much. But that was, the mass population was much more disengaged. And just to show you how that maps out, at the start of this year, none of those four institutions were seen as trusted. So we map it on a matrix here of ethics and competence. So NGOs were seen as ethical, but not terribly good at getting the job done. Business was seen as pretty good at getting the job done, but not terribly ethical. Media was not sitting in a good place, and government particularly was sitting in a bad place. Now, I've seen one of these for the UK government at the start of the year, which was right in the Brexit turmoil, and the government point was at the very bottom point, and so was media. They were actually almost in the red. So also really relevant for this group is that healthcare was sitting pretty much, it was pretty stable, the percentage of trust in Australia. So we started measuring it in 2016, not a lot of significant change. Australia was sitting, the healthcare sector was probably sitting only just under food and beverage and just above tech. And our theory about why tech had come off a little bit was fears about cybersecurity, and also don't forget that the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and people becoming more and more aware of sort of fake news, and that's towards the end of last year. What we did see at the start of this year was a decrease in trust across a whole lot of markets. Australia came off 4 points at the start of the year. So people weren't feeling, overly confident, not a massive change either way. But also for this group, I think the subsectors are probably really interesting. So trust decreased globally in about 4 out of the 5 subsectors of the health that was studied. And why did we think that there were decreases in trust globally across almost all these subsectors? So hospitals and clinics had a 2-point drop. They were still sitting in fairly trusted territory, possibly because of those on the front lines delivering care. This group came under fire for surprise medical billing in some markets, overcrowding and lack of access in others. In the biotech life sciences place, they pretty much stable at 64%. Biotech maintained its trust advantage over pharma. Previous trust studies found that people believed biotech was responsible for innovation and medical breakthroughs, while pharma was responsible for driving up cost. Not necessarily terribly fair, but that was the perception. In the insurance space, there was a bit of a drop, and whether it's provided by the government or by private companies, insurance is a local issue, and fluctuation in trust are concerned almost universally by local access to care and the actual coverage and the cost. Consumer health, there was a little bit of a drop there too. 2-point drop moves consumer health from trusted to neutral, so that was a little bit of a concern, and that was probably due to high profile cases against over-the-counter and healthcare products. And then pharma, there was a 1-point drop to 57% trusted, leaving them in neutral territory. Consistently, pharma has been the least trusted subsector of healthcare, and previous trust data has found that pharma receives the most blame for the cost of medicines, rightly or wrongly. So what was interesting when we did this is that the healthcare trust inequality was closing. While we had a 23-point gap between, in the general trust, the informed public and the mass population were actually coming closer together. And if you look at how much more trusting mass population was generally, they were sitting in the 40s generally. So they were trusting healthcare much more than other institutions. With the trust declines in business overall, as well as drops of trust in healthcare, it was potentially a warning sign that the healthcare industry might have been losing the trust of some of its stronger advocates. Now, a lot can happen in 6 months, and here's something just to show you what's happened since we did that. And what we did when we were preparing to do the trust barometer early this year, we actually went back to market because that was the time that the bushfires had been ravaging Australia, and there was a remarkable change. And this is what I show to show the shifting sands of trust. It can be very quickly won, but it can obviously quickly drop off as well. So that, remember I was talking about that trust gap of 23 points. We'll have a look at what happened between the end of last year and February this year. And our theory is that at the start of the year, the informed public was sitting okay. They were feeling fairly comfortable, like, I'm all right, Jack. But the bushfires and all the talk about the environment really gave people a shake, and they moved from extremely high trusted territory back into neutral. That was a massive drop in just a couple of months. What's interesting is that the mass population essentially didn't move. So while the informed public was probably skewing high, they came back much closer to the mass population. So again, I talked about the shifting sands of trust. We also went back to market with an international study to see how people were going once COVID-19 had come up. This is an extraordinary change. So at the start of this year, we had nobody sitting in trusted territory, and this is what it's looking like now. So if you go back to January, no institutions were trusted. NGOs and business were more trusted than anyone else. Have a look at that. So people have turned to government in this, unprecedented, hideous time as to look for them to protect them. NGOs have come up into trusted territory, and so have business, and even media, who are usually dealt with a healthy dose of skepticism themselves, have come back up 5 points. And we have seen a massive turn to earned media and those major mastheads. So happily for the people on this call, what that also means is that we're at an all-time high trust in healthcare. So where we're sitting pretty well, a little bit off in January 2020, we're now sitting at 75% trust. This is the most, making the sector trusted by a record 76% globally. And this is the largest trust increase we've seen in healthcare since it's been included in the Trust Barometer study. Notice the global cleanse in trust in healthcare from years earlier. It was a little bit bumpy. It's definitely not at the level we're seeing currently. And what we've seen, a watch out is while we've seen on a larger scale, trust and booms are coming for a moment in time. Yes, so I've just got a question. Could the informed public 2020 be an outlier that resulted in the big gap? No, the informed public has been sitting at that much higher level for some time. So if I don't have those stats with me, but informed public has been tracking in Australia much higher than the mass population. So noticing that the government trends in healthcare from years earlier, no worries. We've, as I was saying, booms are often followed by trust busts. So this is the discussion I'd like to have with you today. Now that the trust has come your way, what do you do with it? So we've got some ideas, a bit of a pathway at the end. So not only has healthcare seen a big improvement in trust, but subsectors have actually had a big increase as well. Most notable here is pharma's biotech, which is the first time that's happened in a long time, now moving to the second most trusted subsector. Hospitals at the top have consistently remained the most trusted subsector in healthcare, but we can also have a little quick look at that at a market level. So if we're talking about seeking trustworthy information and credible voices, again, this is a really important slide for the people on the call. There's a lot of concern about the reliability of coronavirus information, and I'm sure that your peers will probably, and the people around you will support this. There's people that worry that there's a lot of fake news and false information being spread about the virus. And I'm not sure if you've seen this morning that President Trump has come out slamming Dr. Fauci, who at the same time actually received the first ever citation for, service to the medical industry and having served 6 presidents. They're just basically making things up. It's people are worried that it's been difficult for them to find reliable and trustworthy information about the virus and its effects, and the opportunity for healthcare, which I'd like to circle with a big red circle, but I'll do that virtually, is that we need to hear more from scientists and less than politicians. Now, we did a little bit of a supplementary survey. I don't have those slides here, but for the New South Wales government, and we saw that after the Premier, the most trusted source was the Chief Health Officer. So that's Kerry Chant in New South Wales, and obviously there are different ones in the different states, but they want to hear the facts. And in terms of who's following the news with coronavirus data, people are still looking at least once a day, and if not several times a day, for where that information is coming from. Now, this is a global snapshot, but we're pretty sure that this is consistent in Australia. The typical daily news engagement is at least 39%, and I spoke before about what I'd call the flight to quality. So we've seen a massive uptick for subscriptions and readership of our traditional mastheads. And I think what's probably relevant for those on the call is that during the coronavirus, the ABC website became the #1 news site in Australia. And that I don't think it has ever happened before, but people were checking and checking again for reliable information. So, earned media are believed most readily in terms of news sources. So we look at national media, local media, quite trusted. But what's also interesting here is that owned information is actually, so on your own channels, is also has a relative degree of trust. But you can see that number with the boxes down the bottom is, I don't believe it's true if this is the only place I see it. So that means that we sometimes have to have a touch point with readers or audiences more than once for them to actually do that. We can't just do what we did in the past, which is send out one piece of communication. We need to make sure we've got a steady drumbeat of updates and helpful tips and information going out there. So trust in news sources is at an all-time high. You can see that traditional media line has fallen into distrusted territory for a while, but this is this flight to quality. People are searching for trustworthy information, and while the traditional media is the most trusted, trust in search engines and owned media have also gone up. So even social, which was, you know, not sitting terribly highly, has come up. So now more than ever, companies need to employ a mix of communication platforms for sharing their stories. Previous trusts have shown that people need to see information from multiple sites and sources to believe it's true. So people are worried about the politicisation of the crisis, and people are thinking that that leaders are making the situation may seem worse than it is for political gain. Look, we're seeing in Australia at the moment that we have the national government, you know, having fisticuffs with the state governments, and even the state governments bickering amongst themselves. My gut, and I have no research to say this, but my take on that is that people are a little bit over that, and I find it extraordinary that you know, Dan Andrews has consistently been attacked from all fronts, but continues to have a really high level of support. So I think that's really interesting. So this is again really interesting for these people on the call. Another promising opportunity for us all is that the most trusted voices during the pandemic are those of the healthcare expert. If you look at who they trust first, it's doctors, it's scientists, and it's national health officials. We've also got online health experts, local government leaders, and WHO officials. I don't think the WHO officials apply so much here. We've seen a little bit of a backward step in a person like yourself, so peers, if I hear it from someone like me, that's come off a little bit. But what's also interesting, if you're responsible for internal comms or engagement, is that the CEO of your company, as an expert on this, how we're traveling through this and how we're going to come through this, people have turned to their employers, so the leaders of their country. They're saying, can you show us the way forward? So there's a really strong opportunity there. And also, we all know, I think, that employers as advocates is probably one of the most untapped engagement methods in Australia. I think there's so much more that we could all be doing. NGO reps have come up, and even journos, they're still sitting at 48%, but they've come up from, yeah, don't believe a word they say, to maybe I should be listening to that. I don't know if you saw that Norman Swan come out yesterday and praise Victoria, but that was trending on Twitter for the entire day. So regular guidance from health authorities is absolutely wanted. So people wanting to know how they can avoid spreading the virus, the latest scientific findings, that is all leapt upon really quickly, where people can get tested, progress towards a vaccine. And I think one of the things that has contributed to trust in Australia is the cooperation and collaboration we've seen amongst healthcare organisations themselves, and also with the government. It seems to we've turbocharged decision making, and things have happened in a matter of weeks which might have taken years. And there's also been some extraordinary acts of generosity from healthcare companies who are making things available or working with competitors. Like this is extraordinary times, but I really feel that healthcare companies have come to the fore there. So, looking for brands to lead positive change. You know, the pandemic is a pivotal moment for healthcare companies. We've got this high trust, so what are we going to do with it? Companies must not only deliver on the public's urgent needs. Sorry, someone's just asked, did we ask about people's interest in research and clinical trials? I don't have that data. I can take it on notice and see if we have that. I certainly have seen some commentary that there was a flight, that there was people turning to healthcare organisations, but I will come back to you on that one, so I just don't have it in this deck. So the pandemic's a pivotal moment. So how are we going to actually kind of bank that trust and build on it? Because we know this moves. So what we need to do is make their commitment to society more broadly. And I always feel like when I talk about society, I'm doing like my daughter's I'm debating like our society tells us, but these are really deep studies that tell us that. And this is a really interesting one, is that the pandemic has put a spotlight on societal inequities. So it's made people realise that the gap in this country between the rich and the working class, and we need to be doing something more to fairly distribute our country's wealth and prosperity. You might see that the reaction to the federal budget here was very much along those lines, both on gender equity lines, but also on, well, the tax cuts are going to sort of the wealthier. I mean, I don't actually know how you give a tax cut to the middle and not the higher, but the government's absolutely got their work cut out for them. And also those with less education, less money and fewer resources are being unfairly burdened. And we're seeing this play out in Australia with, casual workforces more impacted, and the struggle to get through. There's absolute fear around what happens when JobKeeper drops off. But yeah, you've got 2/3 of people generally saying, I think we need to do more. So this is where a purpose-driven organisation can really come to the fore. And indeed, a lot of the work that we've been doing at Edelman has been that purpose-driven thing. So whether it's IKEA looking to contribute and support in domestic abuse, to Unilever on climate change, the companies are stepping up, and they're kind of shedding some of their more risk-averse things and saying, no, this is the time, and this is, I can't emphasize enough, if there are things that you are doing, and we know that so many ethical companies are doing in this space, just a gentle reminder to make sure you talk about it. So to this, so people's talking about a deal breaker in choosing their brands, and this is probably more in the consumer space, which I think is going to be relevant for people on this call. People are saying more and more that I must be able to trust the brand to do what is right. And that's 81% of consumers. That's a massive number. And also, as I alluded to before, people are looking to their own employers to tell me more, to be that trusted source of information, but they want to make sure that the businesses are doing things to to protect their employees. In Australia, touch wood, we seem to be going okay, and there's everything that I've seen in every healthcare company has been an incredible level of care, not just for their own people, but for their stakeholders and customers as well. So I think we're doing okay on that, but I think it's just a timely reminder. So businesses are not seen as meeting the challenge with as expected level of competence. People are saying that less than half agree that they are assuring the most needed products and services are readily available. Even fewer believe they're doing a good job of protecting essential workers. I would challenge this. This is an international study. I think that this has actually been skewed by overseas, because everything I'm seeing in Australia, I would estimate, if I break that down for Australia, we're probably more up towards the 60s, but that is a completely me flying by the seat of my pants. That's just my impression. But I think the last one is the one that we should look to, is how we're preparing for the eventual recovery and figuring out how to return things to normal as quickly as possible. This just is a little aside, but when they announced in Victoria that they were changing some of those very, very, very tough restrictions, I saw a whole lot of traffic on Twitter that people were being texted during Daniel Andrews' press conference by their hairdressers saying, would you like an appointment, because the hairdressers haven't been open. And so people were sitting there watching Dan Andrews speak, and all the hairdressers were sitting there ready to go, ready to make the most of opening their doors, and were literally filling up their books within the hour of Dan Andrews doing that. So that's a very small example of how you can make the most of it, and kudos to them. And I know that a whole lot of people were keen to fix their tresses. So to increase trust, business must join the fight against the pandemic. And I won't touch on this one too much, because I do feel that in Australia we are doing pretty well on that front. But probably, again, the last point is one that we should make sure that we're taking careful attention to, which is making sure that we're redefining the purpose and goals around the mission of fighting this pandemic, and healthcare generally. Excuse me. So brands, it's really important that we serve as an information source. So this is an international study, but they want companies to tell them that. So going back to where people trust information, owned channels. So your website, your own socials, EDMs, newsletters, webinars like this. This is a really important source to make sure that you're still telling your story. And there's absolute expectations for brand to use their power to educate. So your trust has gone up. So what are you doing to make sure that you're telling people how to protect themselves and how to care for themselves? And just on the last few slides are going to be about nurturing trust with healthcare employers. And this is going back to what we did earlier, but we think there's some really good stuff in here. Is employers tend to trust the sector of the business that they're employed in at higher levels than that of the general public. So if we look at healthcare, we're sitting 5 points up. They were fairly trusting anyway, but we've seen a 5-point increase in employee trust. And again, from everything that I've seen in the healthcare, these are the people on this call, you've all taken such care of your people, and I commend you for it. So a lot of the work I've been doing is exactly as I am now, sitting in my bedroom with a Zoom screen behind me, and that's exactly how I've been interacting with a lot of my stakeholders. There's been so much being done remotely to protect people and also inform them about how you're bringing them in. And this is a key opportunity to grow trust from the inside out. So if you've got people who feel that they're being looked after and trust their employer, they are going to spread the word for you. And I spoke a little bit before about employee engagement and employees as ambassadors. Don't forget that you have a workforce that are so proud to work for you. And I believe Margaret Stewart from Nestle's on the call. I've seen your employees absolutely broadcasting all of the things that your organisation has done, not just through COVID-19, but changing their approach during Black Lives Matter. So that absolutely resonates wherever you go. And healthcare employers are meeting employees' expectations. So they're feeling that people are well employed, and they are looking that people are feeling that the overall expectations are being met. I would suggest that in Australia, this would probably skew a little bit higher as well. And just a reminder that people are really worried about themselves and their health. But just remember that people are worried about losing their jobs. Now, that's only 47% worried about losing their jobs in the healthcare sector. If you look at the broad sector, that number is actually 80%. So people are feeling a lot more secure relatively in the healthcare sector, but that's still about half the workforce who are worried. And just remembering employee engagement principles, if people are worried about the very basics, how long their jobs for, that they've got something, they've got continuity, that they've got tenure, they're not going to be worried about too much else unless those basic needs and assurances are met. So I would encourage you to keep reminding people and keep engaging people about how important they are to the success of your company, because that will probably increase trust with them, and also from a commercial perspective, productivity. But they also worried about people, pandemic related hardships. So just be really aware of that. While it's much better in this sector, that's still a significant number. And I think I alluded to this before, but I trust my CEO to tell me the truth. And but in terms of meeting the demands placed on the pandemic, I think this has got a bit of an international skew. As people were scrambling, I think that the number would be much, much higher in Australia. So I'm getting onto my last slide here, which is the safeguarding trust in health. And I've spoken a lot about the bank of trust has gone up so much just in this very short while. And I have to give a lot of credit to everyone on this call and your organisations for everything that you've done. But what do you do now? So our takeaways are these: that tangible actions needed to preserve trust for the long term. We've got this lean and this skew towards you. What can you do to keep that engagement and keep building on that? So think really hard about that. Healthcare has got to be at the centre of a larger societal change, and we've seen that, and the reliance on expertise and the reliance on data coming, and also unprecedented collaboration of movement in this sector. making sure that we lean into innovation and clearly explain the science. Let's not get caught up in jargon. I hope I'm not too cheeky, but certainly having done lots of pieces of information for healthcare organisations, once it goes through medical approval and legal approval and brand approval and CEO approval, sometimes we get caught up in our own jargon. We need to keep coming back to explaining it in the simplest, most inclusive possible terms. Don't use corporate speak. It's really easy to go down that path, but in my view, as a communicator, it's our job to be sort of the harbinger of common sense and to know how these stories will land. Make sure you partner with employees. I feel like I've banged on about employees a lot, but address their concerns, because if those concerns are met and they're feeling comfortable, this is how you build on this trust bank. And again, be the source of trustworthy information shared across multiple platforms. So yes, earned media. Speak to your people directly. Talk, have talking points when you're talking to your stakeholders and your suppliers. Make sure that you are there telling consistent stories in real human terms, and don't make it abstract, make it concrete. Show them how things have changed. Infographics, pictures, faces. That's the stories that are going to resonate. So I feel like I've banged on a lot, Brenda. Shall I hand over to you?
Great. Wow. Thank you so much. I have lots of questions myself, but that was really wonderful. And I feel like there's so much more beneath all of those headline slides that you could talk to us about. So I'll kick it off. I've been texted some questions and there's been some come through on the Q&A. So I'll just get stuck in no particular order. First one is right at the beginning, talking about the gap between the informed versus the mass. Why are they less trusting? I guess there may be an obvious answer, but why are they less trusting? And is there something that should be done overtly to build the trust amongst the mass, or frankly, you always, any thoughts?
Yes. You could even do it. No, it's not the haves and the have-nots, but you are talking to the top quarter were kind of comfortable, that they were doing okay financially. They felt that the government was doing what the government did. That they weren't anywhere near struggle street, but the mass population they weren't all on struggle street, but they were definitely not feeling that government and business and NGOs and media were acting for them. They were basically sitting there with a fairly healthy level of skepticism, and that had been tracking that way for a long time. It really has been at that bottom all along, whereas the people who were feeling much more comfortable at the top were going, yeah, it's almost like it was an Australian term, yeah, I'm all right, Jack. But then the fires came along and it was like, oh, holy dooly, my home could go, the environment's much worse than I thought. We're going to have to spend a lot of money looking after people. It was really quite frightening, the scale of that, and seeing people who, work to build beautiful homes near the coast or in rural areas, losing that in an instant, and that really shook the foundations of people's comfort.
Okay, all right. How do you avoid losing trust? How do you build trust? How do you avoid losing trust? You've given us some broad examples here. Any little nitty-gritty examples or case studies in healthcare would be great, or in general to do with, kind of products and consumer-oriented businesses.
Well, in an era, if you ever struck in a crisis or an issue, and I'll go back to supply of certain over-the-counter pharmaceutical products when COVID-19 came out, and there was just panic buying generally. If you go above and beyond what your customers, your consumers, and your regulators expect, that actually increases trust. So if you communicate and say, this is where we're at, this is what we're doing, and this is when you expect things to go back to normal, going above and beyond, so that the actions have to meet the words. You literally cannot spin your way out of things. And I think of some large financial institutions, some of which a lot of them have come under real fire, but the way that you come out of that is the actions match the words. And the Commonwealth Bank, which came in for a real slapping around during the financial what do you call it, the Royal Banking Commission actually took a purpose-driven approach, and they made sure that what they were doing matched what they were saying. So that it's got to do that, but it's also making sure that you're communicating regularly. And so there's if you're in an issues or a crisis, then there's a little acronym that I use, and it's concern, action, perspective. So concern, and the concern should not be for you as an organisation. It's got to be for your stakeholders and the people affected. The action that you're taking and the perspective. So, is this a short-term thing, or is what we're doing? So making sure that you're communicating early, and you're telling the story yourself, not having someone else tell it for you, that you're showing your concern and your action is really, really important. And then from now, it's just making sure that there's so much that everyone's doing that you are telling that story. So, and that could be on your own channels. Earned media aren't going to give you a kick along for things that you've done in the community, but it doesn't mean that you can't, share on LinkedIn, that you can't put it on your website, that you can't put a bit of paid behind a website article. It's just actually think about how you can create that bank of information. So if people are searching on your organisation, what doesn't come up is what other people are saying about you, but what you're saying about you. So is that helpful?
Great. Yeah, and just, I guess, building from that, because you could, to me, it sounds like there's a fine line where you can then start to lose trust if you look opportunistic. So this has come up in another context, which is what one of your slides talked about, the good that many organizations, and particularly in healthcare, are doing during COVID and seem to be doing, right? But how do you not look opportunistic when you are using your brand to educate, as per your slide? Where's that fine line, and any handy hints on that?
It's got to be about the impact and the benefit and to other people of what you're doing. It can't be, oh, aren't we good and we're, kicking the tin or whatever. I look, just an example, this is not in healthcare, but I do a lot of work with the wonderful company which owns Fiji Water, and they are doing the most extraordinary job in Fiji at the moment, because that's obviously where they've got a plant, but the economy of Fiji has been decimated, and they have, I think, quadrupled all the CSR efforts that they're doing there. And so we're actually helping to get the word out about that. And we've completely changed the approach on how we do that. And it's not about, oh, we've donated blah. It's like, we're privileged to be planting these trees in the villages that's actually going to, to help that environment. And it's about being humbled and talking about the end benefit. We feel lucky, we feel privileged, or alternatively, if you're partnering with an NGO, let the NGO be the story. Just give them the bigger organisations will actually have the tools to do that. Let them amplify them and let them be the story. It's something just randomly that the Telstra Foundation has always done really well. I actually did a bit of analysis of the foundations of some of the top ASX listed companies and the coverage that they got. And because I had a client who was going, why won't the Fin Review cover my $1 million donation to that? And I'm like, well, the journalists are a bit cynical about stuff like that. So I did a bit of analysis, and the Telstra Foundation champions their partners. The media release doesn't go out on their letterhead. They're a big player and they amplify that. But if you looked over the course of the year that I did that analysis, I think they got something like 300 or 400 pieces of coverage over the year, whereas other foundations got 1 or 2. And that was because they were making the partner, the benefit, the impact, the champion. Make sense?
Yep. Okay. Got it. Thank you. Onto the topic of scientists, I have 2 questions here. One is, what makes a credible scientist or medical expert in your view? And building from that is, how do you appeal to the mass as well as informed? Because presumably the mass is going to be the bulk of our target markets for products, but not be overly technical or overly superficial. So any hints around that?
Yeah, so can you ask me the first question second? Because I got excited by the second one.
Okay.
So just come back.
What makes, how do you pick, or what makes a good scientist or medical expert? Just, how do you?
I think someone, and they don't all have to be Ginny Mansbergs or Carl Kozeckis, they don't, or Norman Swans, who are very talented communicators. They can be comfortable in their own skin, but if they're talking confidently and competently, and showing, not just talking about the data, but what that means. And that's one of the challenges as a communicator, is people quite often come out with great rafts of data, but as I've just hopefully just demonstrated, it's the so what. So I can show you, I think I've just shown you 42 slides of data, but hopefully I've been saying this is what you do with that, and that's what the impact is. And that is true of any data set. So if you can get the scientists to say, so what the action is or what the concern is, that is really where those insights pay dividends. And the second one was, how do we get to the mass public, right? I always talk about, I don't know if everyone knows, but the literacy age of, say, the Daily Telegraph, they aim for a reading age of 8, and the Sydney Morning Herald runs for a reading age of 13. So it's a real challenge in healthcare, when we are making sure that we are legally compliant and that we're medically compliant, but it's the car park test. How do you explain it to someone that you've just met? And that is the job as communicators, is communicating it in the simplest and the clearest way, and not using passive voices, shorter sentences, infographics, and showing people is really important. So you kind of have to challenge yourself and then challenge yourself again. So once you've done a piece of communication, you think that's fine, it goes through all the approvals, come back and go, is that fit for purpose? And sometimes I feel like I'm banging a bit of a drum in the communication space, but that's also where you add value, and understanding that if they do that, there's barriers to behavioural change, right? So people need to understand the benefits, but you also need to overcome the barriers to get people to change. So people might be going, yeah, I know that. But if you make it easier to access, or you give them a tool or a little quiz or something like that, to make something that helps them get closer to that engagement, is really important.
Okay, great.
And a variety of ways. Some people like to read, some people like to view, but the more visual you can be, whether that's even just little infographics on a carousel, I know works really well for really big tech companies if you haven't got time to do a big video. But it also can be a little bit raw. It doesn't all have to be absolutely beautifully edited. Sometimes just, a leader talking into their phone for education purposes is just as effective as anything that's still beautifully produced.
Right. Okay, great. What happens when trust is lost, and how long does it take to get it back? Because how long is it bring?
It's got the two major things are competence and ethics. So you've got to be showing that your actions match your words, and that you're behaving ethically, and that you're doing what you say you're going to do competently. Just a word on the importance of a trust bank. And I am not offering a political opinion here, but I've been watching with fascination the whole turmoil around Gladys Berejiklian, and I think, in my opinion, as an avid political watcher as well, is Gladys's trust bank was so high that it's definitely taken a blow. But to me, that's why she's so there, because she has been so diligent, and so concerned. She's not someone who plays political games. She's almost, and I actually saw her speak one time, and she talked about being a bit of a school prefect. It's always really diligent in doing her homework and making sure she delivers. And I think people get that about her, and not knowing what's going to come next in all of that. But I think the reason that she's still there, and that there has been the support from certain sectors that there have been, is because she's always done what she said she was going to do.
Okay, good. One last question. I just want to go back to the scientist question. Often brands will, I'll say, partner and have a scientist or a medical expert as a spokesperson, an ambassador, et cetera, et cetera. How effective is that versus referring to a scientist, an expert, et cetera, that is doing work that supports also what the brand is about? If you, because aren't people getting a bit cynical that they're, kind of a paid voice for the brand? And given our industry is all about kind of science, what's that? Sorry.
No, look, our experience shows them, and also HCPs also, even if they're in paid partnerships, our experiences that paid HCPs actually influence other HCPs positively. I think you need to be careful that you don't keep going back to the one person, and obviously that you need an expert that's credible in the particular field that you're talking about. But our experience this year is we have done a number of those partnerships, and the engagement and the reaction and the around those has been still really strong. So I think you have to pick credibly, make sure that you rave it, move that around in terms of that, and also be really transparent about whether that is a partnership. Obviously, we have really high ethical and regulatory standards to adhere to, so you've always got to be very, very careful of that. And if you've got your own scientist in-house, great, and you think you can sort of media or presentation train them, absolutely, that's worthwhile. Is this where I can say I do media training? But anyway. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I want to go into the employee one. You talked about there's an increase in employee trust, and they're really looking to employers more so than ever before to provide some guidance, some info source, etc. I'm wondering if that increase in employee trust has gone hand in hand because of the flexibility and compassion that companies might not otherwise typically be showing employees. And what about post-COVID, therefore? Has that changed employees' expectations? I'm sure it has, but any thoughts around that?
Yeah, absolutely. That trust has coming up because people feel looked after. And there's also been, there's been any number of studies that shows that, you know, 2/3 of people actually don't want to come back into the office full time. They're saying, oh, actually, I quite like this arrangement, and I'd like to stay at home 2-3 days a week. So therein lies the rub for employers. If you think that everyone's going to come back straight away, I'd be managing that carefully. And if I even use Edelman's experience, so we had probably our employees were grouped into 3. We had people who just didn't enjoy being at home, whether that was because they were completely on their own or they're in share houses and they just liked that interaction, and they were absolutely chomping at the bit to come back to the office. We have some people who, for family reasons or because they themselves or family were immunocompromised, have elected to continue working from home, and they're still 100% at home. And then there's people like me who probably a little bit of column A, column B. I actually do love going to the office, and we've rostered on at the moment 50% in the office at any one time. So we just to make sure that we do social distancing. But I quite like, and I'm presenting in my tracky dacks now, but 2 days a week I actually do put on my waisted pants and nice shoes, and I go in and have a decent coffee and have that human interaction. And for me, that works well because I do bounce off people, but then I also have the time to really focus on things. So I think the challenge for employers is the expectations are high. So don't think that all of a sudden they're all going to be back on deck and doing that. I think listening to them and making sure that you're demonstrating you're listening to them and working through that with them is going to be really key to maintaining that trust, but also the productivity and the retention once things come back to normal. And don't we all wish they'll be back to normal soon? And if anyone's actually listening from Melbourne, heart goes out to you. It's just extraordinary, and hopefully that you've had a walk outside your 5 kilometre zone already. So
curious, in Australia, we've done well during COVID, with our numbers and et cetera. Do you think that has contributed to people trusting the government more? Is it kind of relative to how they're seeing other world leaders and what's going on in other countries, or is it just in and of itself, given the times and given how the government has communicated? And any perspective on that?
Yes. While we're seeing some interesting things, so the federal government's not very happy with the Queensland government. The New South Wales government's not particularly happy with the Queensland government. The federal government's really unhappy with the Victorian government. But then if you look at the studies of the people in those areas, particularly Queensland and Victoria, they feel like we talked about go above and beyond what's expected. They feel that their government generally is doing what's there to protect them, and it's not every single person. There are certainly industries that really rely on that interstate movement and movement of employees, but people kind of feel like it's okay, Jack, where over in WA they closed the border and done it, and they're just moving freely and going around and life is normal. And the WA Premier certainly almost came to fisticuffs verbally with everyone else. The feeling is that people have by and large done okay. I think it's a bit disappointing, the squabbling about who's done what to whom and who's responsible, for the Kiwis going to Victoria. I just think it's unfortunate. And my word to them was, just take. People don't like the politics of it and the infighting. They want to make sure that they're being looked after, and there's a watch out, I think, for governments.
Okay. We're almost at time. I have two quick questions, if I could. One is, during COVID, do you think, because people are looking at news more, specifically for COVID information, are they becoming more health literate? And anecdotally, we know that health literacy rates in Australia are only about 40%, at least at the last ABS study, which is pretty shockingly low. Any perspective on that?
I think anecdotally, I would say yes, and the uptick in people wanting the flu vaccine, and even just the stats around the incredible low numbers of flu this year. People are actually realising, holy, what the social distancing and the sanitisation, the impact that can have on their overall health. I think more people might actually understand comorbidities when we're looking at, unfortunately, some of the things that have happened in healthcare. And we actually did a little bit of research literally last week, and it was around vaccines, and we asked people, would they be more inclined to consider vaccine as a part of preventative health? And 43% of people said yes. That's an astonishing number. That's on top of the people who would already consider it. So people are actually understanding and looking to that as an opportunity. So.
Okay, good. All right, one last question. We'll end on a serious but light note. Okay, so I'll combine a couple. Although the trust levels seem to have gone up during COVID and kind of switched to government, et cetera, over time, longer time, X years, have people become more cynical and untrusting? Often people see Aussies as, more cynical about, media and questioning things anyway. So have they become more cynical and untrusting kind of over the longer haul? And with that said, why do people trust influencers like the likes of Kim Kardashian, for instance? Isn't it obviously they will flog anything for a buck? That's the last question from one of our participants.
Well, I won't comment on particular influences, but on the first thing, Australia was sitting in a state of distrust for 10 years. So were we cynical? Oh, yes, we were. But it's taken a crisis for them to go, oh, actually, maybe you could help me, and maybe you're there to protect me, and you could help that. And so that it increases trust. It's what you do from here. And I know that government is probably thinking, this trust isn't going to last because something else will come along. I think it's a little bit different in this area because it's gone up so highly. One of the things that we noticed in we've got a sort of a whole influencer and digital and I will freely admit that is not me. I am corporate healthcare person, like that's me. But I know that there was a real downturn in engagement and purchases across those influencers who are literally, oh, here's my diet shake and all that sort of thing. And what the pivot had to be a pivot. Isn't pivot and unprecedented probably the two most overused words this year, but I'm going to use it. The pivot amongst influencers were to more purpose-driven things. So if people were able to bring a more inclusive and a more caring and potentially a little bit more raw sort of sharing to their influencing work, then that trust in them sort of continued. So, the trust in influencers has definitely taken a dip, and people are much more cynical about, well, they're just trying to flog me something. But if they were doing, here's a bit of self-care you can do, or here's something you can do for somebody else who's stuck at home, or, here's a bit of way to pay it forward, that really up to their stakes. And with the influencer that was mentioned, there's always going to be an audience for that. It certainly isn't me.
Right.
Clearly. Just looking.
All right. Well, I think we're just at time. So I have lots of other questions I'd love to ask you and talk to you about, but thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation, really insightful, lots of food for thought in there. To the participants, thanks for joining us this morning. We had a great turnout. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sharing the slides with you. David Lowe will send that out in the next couple of days. And I'm sure, Susan, if people had specific questions that weren't answered, would you be happy to get an email from them or a phone call? We'll give you your details out when we give the slides.
Sure, absolutely. And I'd just like to finish by saying, Thank you, because it's just been such a hard year, and I know how much healthcare organisations have leaned in, and I see what you do, and I appreciate it enormously. And if I can help in any way or provide any more insight of what I've said today, hit me up.
Great. Okay, thank you very much, and hope everyone has a great rest of day. See you at our next webinar. Bye-bye. Thank you.